Welcome everybody to our webinar today, this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Today we're going to focus in on cyber security as it relates to risk and vulnerability management. Focusing on basically what you can be doing and a little bit peeking under the rock as to the risk management itself, life cycle, the 4 phases, all that sort of stuff. And I did have to look up the expression because I was totally going to mess it up, but it's basically the whole point of an ounce of prevention is equal to a pound of cure. So basically what we're going to talk about today is what it means to be doing it properly, and what are the things that we can be doing to sort of prevent them as much as the cyber attacks as much as possible. So on that note, we'll do a quick intro. This is a lot of words for Earl to say that he's amazing and wonderful and a fantastic storyteller on our side. I'll let you introduce yourself in a sec. I'm going to act as the moderator today. My name is Libby Robinson. I'm the director of product marketing here at Field Effect. Been here for 4 years. Even though next to the likes of Earl, I still feel like a total noob, and I'm learning on a daily basis. Earl, do you want to give a quick intro?
Hi, everyone. My name is Earl. So I've been at Field Effect since kind of the inception, 2017. And right now I'm a director of service strategy, but I sort of came up through the development of our analytic team, wherein a lot of the risk management analytics, which are related to what we're going to talk about today, were conceived of and sort of live. So yeah, I'm coming from the analysis side largely.
All right, so just as a quick walkthrough of what it is that we're going to go through today, just a quick overview of risk management as it relates to cybersecurity and what are the benefits of doing it. Then we're actually going to dive into the sort of those 4 major phases of cybersecurity risk management. So what are the various steps along the way? Then we're going to get into some of the cybersecurity risks that all of us can and probably should be managing on a day-to-day basis. But then an acknowledgement of that's easier said than done, right? So we'll go through a little bit of the risk management challenges, and then we will go through some how-tos. There's no way to spell how-tos. Like, I hate using the acronym, so it's like how-tos or does and don'ts. But anyways, we will walk through some how-tos on cyber risk management. So to kick us off, Earl, why don't you walk us through at a high level the definition of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, the fundamentals of what we're talking about is already embedded in most of what your IT teams will be doing. And really what we're trying to do here is introduce a little bit of formality, maybe a little bit of structure that you can apply to understanding and thinking about and making decisions around risk management. So really what we're talking about, and we're going to break it down into 4 chunks, is the process of identifying where risk might be present in your environment and the forms that that risk might take. How you will make determinations about assessing the likelihood of that risk being realized, and then appropriate prioritization as a byproduct of that, and then ultimately, of course, the response to the management of risk. The totality of what we're talking about is really about, as Libby mentioned, sort of addressing threats before they are actually realized in your environment, all proactively ahead of time in an effort to save not only money, but your teams a lot of time and energy as well. And as you can see from a market perspective, what we're talking about resonates, and there's a considerable amount of investment and energy put into it as well.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting to watch over the course of the past 10 plus years of like security and risk management, sort of, risk management being underneath, and then more and more and more making itself into its own bucket just because of the value and because of the market opportunity there. So I see that cybersecurity risk management is full of benefits. So why don't you walk us through a couple of what those benefits are?
Of course, the most obvious one and probably the biggest ticket item right out of the gate is the simple removal of attack opportunities or vectors, as you might describe them, the elimination of access points, the removal of vulnerabilities and those sorts of things, all is a way of enjoying a more relaxed IT management atmosphere. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, reducing the cost of recovery and those sorts of things. That is by far the primary and most significant benefit, I would say, from a practical perspective. Of course, that extends down beyond eliminating the likelihood of an attack, making your organization less attractive to attackers, ultimately results in better, your teams feeling better, being able to perform better, and having less tactical worry interrupting what ought to be, good quality IT management.
Yeah, and I always like to liken it to a sort of analogy that one of our other cyber analysts used with me about how it's really about making the target on you and your organization like as teeny tiny as possible, right? And akin to something that we do every day in terms of risk management is, we all go to the dentist once every 6 months or a year to make sure that we don't have any cavities. But in the meantime, we brush our teeth and we floss our teeth when we remember we should do so. And we take these preventative measures so that when we do go to the dentist, which we still have to do, hopefully, the anything we're bringing there is as non-existent as possible, right? So it's kind of that, like, really all of us are managing our lives with a bit of risk management in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so getting into some of the four phases, and you gave us a little bit of a spoiler alert there. Why don't we start with first just identifying what they are in the first place?
Yep, absolutely. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through four phases or components. You can think of them linearly or as a cycle, of course. And where we begin is with identification. And really what we're talking about here is understanding your environment. We often use the mantra, know your environment, know the risks to it, and what to do about them. And that's manifest in these four phases. But the fundamental starting point is knowing what you're responsible for and therefore for protecting and risk managing. Um, we often use some real world metaphors. You can see in the example here a really, really simple one that kind of resonates and you can use on your own. If you think about building or home security as an example, what we're talking about here is knowing things like the points of access, your doors, windows, and all of those sorts of things, sort of building up. And of course, in parallel, beginning to identify where vulnerabilities or risks might be present in those access points or points of entry, depending on how you want to describe them. So in the context of your door, you might have a simple lock that you could add a more robust lock to, and then a sophisticated alarm system, et cetera, sort of building upon notions of defense in depth, which you'll hear as we go on. But at this fundamental initial stage, really what we're looking for, and you'll hear terms like asset management and many other similar sorts of terms and processes, but a fundamental understanding of the IT real estate, the footprint, the devices that are present, the accounts that are present, the users of those systems, the owners of them as well, the services that are running on them, just understanding very well the outside edges of that IT environment that you're responsible for, and then building in a good understanding of where vulnerability will be present, which kind of moves us into the next component.
Yeah, and this is something I've heard you say a lot in terms, not only in terms of the preventative risk management, vulnerability management side, but even as it relates to cybersecurity protection itself, is that you can't protect what you can't see, right? So it really just starts with that kind of visibility and understanding of your environment. Yeah. All right, let's move on to, once we have identified, what's next?
Now that we've got our hands around the IT environment that we're responsible for, and we've begun to identify where risks might be present based on our understanding of that IT environment, we need to understand and make determinations about the likelihood of those risks being realized. What impact would they have if they were realized? And you can, in parallel, begin to examine some of the paths of that the impact might sort of be realized as the attacker moves down. So as an example, understanding that you have old and unpatched systems in your environment is obviously critical. We're going to talk about the nature of some of these common risks as we go on, but understanding their context in your environment, whether they're internet facing as an example, informs your assessment of the likelihood of the risk being realized. So at the second stage, what we're doing is we're combining our deep understanding of our environment with now expertise and enrichments, in fact, around an assessment of the viability of that risk, the likelihood of it being exploited, even by accident. That's another important piece to understand here. In the context of cybersecurity, we often focus on bad actors, hackers, and all of those kinds of things. But a lot of the risk management that we're talking about here is often actually manifest or realized by accident. Misconfigurations are a great example. And so at this assessment stage, you must be mindful not only of the possibility of a threat actor leveraging awareness of an exposed service that you know is perhaps out of date, but even just the accidental misuse of a system or something like that, and the likelihood of that occurring. And this is where we will talk a little bit down the road about things like user awareness training and those sorts of things. So at this assessment stage, there's a number of different tools and techniques and workflows that you might apply. There are some very practical methods related to some of the prioritization steps that we're going to talk about next that relate to things like vulnerability scoring. But essentially, you and your team should take some time to understand not only where risk is present in your environment, but then to begin to understand how that risk will be realized and the likelihood of it happening at this assessment phase.
Yeah, I think really what you're talking about is really close to the sort of standard risk table of any kind of risk that you're managing, right? What is the risk? What's the likelihood? What's the impact? And then what's the mitigation should those occur? And when you do that, of course, you're trying to do the ones that have the highest impact. In case if that does occur, it's going to have a massive impact. So those are the ones that I want to start mitigating, and especially those ones high likelihood, high impact. And I think this is where we see some of the biggest challenges for people trying to do it on the cyber side is there is identifying the risk. I hear a bunch of risks, but then also knowing like, in what order should I focus my attention in order to address these, right? Like those really can be the biggest challenge. So going into that, so we've done step 1 and step 2. What next?
So now we're going to begin to take response or mitigation actions, as we would often refer to them. And so following on from our assessment, and we've taken some time to prioritize, as Libby just described. And like I said, there are many different methods by which we might prioritize risk and its likelihood of being realized. Software vulnerability management is one great example where you can leverage tools like a CVE score to help you with simple prioritization. But ultimately, at this response stage, we're now taking active actions in our environment, whether they're proactive or reactive, to, as we said earlier, shrink or reduce our attack surface. So the elimination of a vulnerability in a software context is something most people understand and recognize, whether it's patching or updating or whatever it might be. But there are many other types of vulnerability mitigations that you're going to need to be mindful of. All, of course, flowing from that identification stage where you understand the nature of your IT environment. But we're going to talk about some examples that reflect common sort of categories of risk, like misconfiguration, and some specific ones, like the exposure of services like RDP, that represents a very high degree of vulnerability. And those are not just simple software patching, but require a more depth of awareness and understanding of the IT environment and related response capabilities as well. There are also layers that apply to this response stage as well. Not only is there the practical, tactical addressal of something like a software vulnerability, but as you can see in our second bullet point, you might also be able to implement higher order security controls, whether those are business processes or technical controls, but that will help as an additional sort of response action after the fact. A simple example might be limiting the availability of your employees or your workers to install software on their devices. That's a great example and a very simple example of a security control that you might take as a response action to something that went bad, but that will carry on as time persists and improve your overall threat surface. And then, of course, the last piece at this response stage is the acceptance of risk. Not all risk, of course, can be mitigated, whether it's a technical mitigation or not. Some risk must be dealt with and accepted to some degree. So hopefully from that identification and assessment stage, at that assessment stage, you've been able to do things like understand the likelihood of the risk being realized and inform your acceptance based on that. All very, very important. And there's a lot of different moving pieces at play in this response stage, depending on the nature of the risk, of course.
Yeah, I think there's a huge difference between just having the risk be unknown and not acting on it, and actually being educated, understanding, and then saying, okay, for these reasons, this is just a risk that we will or have to accept. Okay, so we've identified, we've assessed, we've responded, we're done, right? This is it. It's a 3-part process and we're done. No, I think you're going to walk us through the final. It is not a one and done phase. Hold on, my slides will work. Yeah, they will.
Yeah, we blew the surprise by saying there were 4 steps ahead of time. Yeah, so as I said earlier, you can think of this as a linear kind of 4-step or stage kind of process, or as a cycle is kind of how I like to think about it more, because the monitoring piece should relate to your identification step one piece, ideally. There should be sort of a synergy between the monitoring that you have in place and the insight that it provides you from an IT management and a risk management perspective. And it is at this stage where, akin to the response, you have an opportunity to institute monitoring that will persist and provide value over a long period of time, and will provide you with a range of insights that you can leverage from a risk management perspective, not just like singular narrow views into your IT environment. A firewall is a great example, right? It gives you a very powerful but narrow slice of view of your environment. And so from a monitoring perspective, the broader your aperture, of and into your environment, the better your capability or your opportunity to do good risk management will be. So at this final phase, I like to kind of reinforce the relationship between monitoring and identification. The monitoring piece, obviously, most of us immediately think about security outcomes, the detection of nefarious activity and alerts and those sorts of things. But there's also a lot of great and valuable telemetry from our devices and from our cloud services and those sorts of things in this monitoring context that can be leveraged in risk management that are not quite as like day-to-day tactical as you might think of the detection of a hacker, trying to infiltrate your network. This is where things like patch management, misconfiguration identification, the recognition of weak forms of encryption. We'll talk about some of these to come, but they relate to and are reflections of the importance of having great monitoring.
Perfect. I also think that nefarious is one of my favorite terms in cybersecurity. It just, I don't know, endless joy in the word nefarious. Okay, so we've talked about sort of the life cycle. And as you say, it is a life cycle. It's not a 1, 2, 3, 4 done. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. It just is sort of this cycle or this continuation. Next, and sort of, walk us through some of the types of cyber risks that are that we should be monitoring for, we should be managing. And I think the interesting thing about this discussion is always that there's so much talk about new techniques and AI this and what's the impact it's going to have on cybersecurity. And then I think what we keep seeing though is a lot of the things are still got to have the basics down, right? Like what are those things that continue to sort of that sort of catch us off guard? So yeah, walk us through some of the types of cyber risks that we should be managing.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a bunch of are very specific risks on patch software being the first example. But these are great reflections of categories of risk at a slightly higher level. So yes, no, please, Libby, jump right into the first one there. Yes, so unpatched software is where we're going to begin. This is by far the most common, I would say, vulnerability or aspect of risk that IT teams must manage on a very regular basis, daily practically, particularly if you think about web browsers, a really, really good example. And again, of course, depending on the complexity of your software environment, patching and related lifecycle management might be super trivial. It might be very easy for your teams. But that might not be the case. And you might have things like legacy software on devices that you might not exactly know where they are, even depending on the nature of your organization. And so this very first and most common risk is huge and impacts organizations like big and small. As I mentioned, web browsers are probably my favorite and least favorite example of software vulnerabilities, like of a recurring fashion these days, that are exploited very quickly in the wild, and that frankly, there is a program of exploitation development for, and that IT managers must be vigilant about. Luckily, many of us have the good fortune of being able to set our browsers to auto update. But that's not the case for all of the software in our IT environment. And so IT teams know all about this and live it every single day. And the degree to which that the software environment or the risks to it change is really quite staggering, frankly. If you spend any time doing a quick survey of CVE, so Common Vulnerability Enumeration publications, NIST in the United States publishes them and is one of probably the most reliable hub of such a set of information. But a quick look at software vulnerabilities in 2024, if you've not done such a thing, is definitely worth a Google search to get a sense of not only the commonality of software vulnerabilities, but the frequency of them and the recurrence of software vulnerabilities in types of software and among particular vendors. Anyway, all of that rolls up into unpatched software being probably our number one and most common type of risk management challenge.
Yeah, and I think this is so for those of us who have been around for a while, not saying our ages or anything like that, but I mean, I remember back in the day doing software updates for every type of software was a massive undertaking, and it would take down, you'd have to be kind of shut down your machine. You also had to do a restart no matter what it was. For some of us who have several tabs open on any on the browsers and stuff, it was like I would lose everything that I had open, right? And I do find there is a sense from the sort of software vendor community that they are trying to make these things a little bit easier. So it's not there's not quite so much end user impact on keeping these things up to date, right? So that is a nice thing to see in the the technology world for sure. But walk us through the next one here.
Yes, so vulnerable operating systems, well, in browsers, I have already spoken about browsers, and in fact, frankly, operating systems very closely related to software management, software vulnerability management. But why we've broken these two out is not only because of the frequency with which these risks are manifest, but because there's an additional sort of complicating set of factors that we frequently encounter around operating system vulnerabilities and the management of them. It has a lot to do with end of life and life cycle management of operating systems, the availability of extended service, the frequency with which extended services are forgotten about and patching then goes unattended to for who knows how long. And in the context of operating systems, we also have a degree of variability depending on the nature of your IT environment. You might be a Linux largely environment, Windows, Mac, you kind of know the story there on the distribution there. And these reflect different levels of effort, attentiveness, and workflows for your teams to manage risks in each of these different contexts. And at a fundamental level, operating system vulnerabilities reflect it's perhaps not fair to say a higher level of risk by necessity, but sort of conceptually, there's a degree of risk here that an attack on the operating system reflects that we think warrants a little bit of a separate focus in any case. So yes, vulnerable operating systems, particularly as they reach their end of life, these are huge challenges for IT teams, especially in a complex IT environment.
Yeah, and actually something you mentioned there reminded me sort of from the software updates through anything really is that, you mentioned sometimes there's things that you've forgotten about. I think it's also the value of having, we talked about the monitoring side of it as well, because there's stuff you may have forgotten about. There may also be some shadow IT that you didn't even know about, right? So it's, it really is important to kind of have that visibility into your system to be able to understand that, to get a good glimpse across the board of your risk landscape, essentially.
Yeah, that's right.
So moving on to an oldie but goldie, I know, is exposed RDP.
Yes, this is a classic. And really, exposed RDP is, well, first of all, it is exactly what it is, exposed remote desktop protocol, which is, common and exploited routinely by attackers, whether it's by way of brute force, or perhaps some social engineering angle wherein they've compromised credentials and then leveraged them. But really, this reflects a class or category of risks that we see exploited or attacked continuously. VPNs, any sort of gateway or access entry point into the network is going to be prodded by attackers and attacked directly once it's identified. In this case, exposed RDP is something that, well, as we've mentioned, we've all known about and seen for forever, basically, from an IT management perspective. It remains a reoccurring threat vector or element of risks that needs to be managed. And interestingly, I think what I want to point out about this one is that it's usually the result of sort of a legacy IT situation. I would say one of the most common challenges that we see is a sort of a team in transition or an organization in transition that has in essence perhaps sort of lost track of some of these service risks that the previous IT team may or may not have managed so well, or that as time has gone on, have naturally been weakened, just as a natural byproduct of sort of the evolution of technology. In any case, exposed RDP, the key takeaway here is that really it's a reflection of a category of risk, and that network gateway access point thing is something that IT teams not only struggle with, but that is a critical and important vulnerability to be managed in those four phases. So the identification phase, and like I said, that's really where this is manifest, is because that identification was missed. This old, usually legacy, service has been unattended and unfortunately exploited as time has gone on. Very, very common.
Penultimately here, I have nothing silly or anything to add there. So moving on to the next one here, end of life software.
Yeah, this relates, well, you can see quite a relationship between a lot of these risks, or a pattern across them. End-of-life software, similar to the operating system challenge. This one is become a little bit more tricky, I think, for a lot of IT teams these days, and it's why we're flagging it here. Some organizations, whether you're inheriting, again, legacy IT that requires that you must maintain some installed software base for your a department that's requiring it, or whatever, or because as time has gone on, the lifecycle management has simply fallen off, and now you have software in your environment that has simply not been attended to, that there's no vendor plan for updating, maintaining, patching, all of those kinds of things. And again, in that identification phase, hopefully what you're able to do is capture a really solid inventory of not only your devices, but obviously the software running on them is critical, but align that with a good view of the software's life cycle, and in particular identifying when that software will reach its actual end of life cycle, as opposed to continuous updates being relied upon. This is a problem that I think statistically probably does not account for the number of attacks, or a super high number of attacks, but is often a secondary vector that's leveraged by an attacker once they've gained access to a network. They discover that there's software in the environment. Sometimes it's administration software, communication software, all different kinds of things that they can leverage. VoIP software as well. We've seen all kinds of things that are legacy pieces. Anyway, yeah, end of life software, big challenge.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask, and hopefully I'm not putting you in the spot here, but I think there's a temptation maybe to think like, oh, it's old software, maybe I'm not using, like, who cares if it's still sitting on my system, right? Like who cares if an attacker hacks into this end of life software? But like that's not their end game, right? Like that is just for them, it's just it's a step on the journey, right? Any sort of way they can find they'll take in order to get further into the system. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and last we have on our list here.
Yes, this one is probably I don't want to say my favorite one, but it's interesting because there's it represents a level of risk that I think a lot of organizations these days, I don't want to say have forgotten about, but it hasn't been on their radar, right? Whether your data is at risk when it is in transit, or at rest in your systems, is something that hopefully IT teams have some insight into and ability to manage. One of the manifestations of that, or one of the greatest risks that's manifest when it comes to privacy and data protection, is the use of weak or outdated transmission protocols or encryption. In fact, you'll hear about data being encrypted by ransomware actors, and they're using very powerful forms of encryption to do that. And it's very common for, in a similar set of patterns to out-of-date software and those sorts of things, for systems, services to be forgotten or simply attended to less and less over time. And as time goes on, weaknesses emerge in them through no fault of their own. And encryption is, I think, perhaps the best example of that, where standards that we used to rely upon even just a few years ago are no longer reliable to the same degree. Now, that's not to say that your data, when you it leaves your network as, in the clear or anything like that necessarily. But what we want to highlight at this stage is that understanding whether you have things like a deprecated encryption suite in use in your environment could be very, very important. Not only from an attacker perspective, like are you able to protect your backups and those sorts of things? Are you able to protect your data as it transits your network or transits the internet? But that these encryption standards are often leveraged as part of like accreditations, insurance, compliance. These regimes demand certain standards in the context of data protection, and those are usually manifest in encryption standards. So we like to highlight this here as a category of risk that needs to be managed as well.
Perfect. Every time I talk about encryption, I go back to my first days of Bob and Alice, learning about Bob and Alice and the handling of keys there from that perspective. Okay, so we walked through sort of the life cycle. We walked through some of the types of cyber risk that that we should be monitoring for and managing. And you might walk away thinking, okay, cool, I have my checklist, I'm good to go. But we know that it can be a little easier said than done, right? So why don't you walk us through some of the challenges? The first one being like it's hard, right? It's complex. There's, as I say, easier said than done. So can you walk us through its complexity?
Absolutely. So we tried to reflect a little bit of this in some of the examples, but in an effort trying to abstract away some of the complexity. But fundamentally, the range of risk types, the paths by which risks might be realized, whether it's by an attacker or by accident. This is a difficult terrain to navigate, and it's a difficult terrain to manage. And it can be made even more difficult in a modern context when you think about things like a remote workforce, perhaps a globally distributed organization, the introduction of cloud services and other types of online-based services. Anyway, all of that to say that complexity and the management of complexity is actually like a fundamental skill as it relates to risk management. In the second bullet, you can see here, tools exist. There are many, and processes and workflows that relate to some of these tools, standards and frameworks. I always default to the software management one and vulnerability management because it's the simplest and easiest example to point to. But there are many, many others. And in fact, depending, as I mentioned on the previous slide, if you have obligations in a compliance context, you might have tools imposed upon you as well. And many of those are fantastic. So that's a key takeaway there. Investments, the third bullet here, investments, they are increasingly common risk management as a practice, as a discipline, as an area of focus and attention in an organizational context. But really the key takeaway that I try and instill here is that visibility, the monitoring piece, is enormous. And the value that insight and aperture can provide can't be understated, can't be overstated. Yes, and that is really the last bullet there, that organizations need to recognize greater visibility. Our threat surfaces or attack surfaces, depending on your lingo of choice, are highly elastic, and it requires a degree of visibility monitoring that, when invested in, pays a significant dividend.
I really like how you phrase that there. I'm gonna add this to another one of the quotes, the Earl quotes that I have in my lexicon. But you said that managing complexity is like a skill. And I know there are tools out there and solutions that can help us with that. But I like the mental framing of it as a skill. It seems more like we have control over it as opposed to the complexity controlling us. I don't know. I just like that. I like that turn of phrase. Okay. And actually, as it relates to that very much, on to point number 2.
Yeah, so the expertise required to do risk management obviously flows out of the type and nature of risks that are common in your context. Here we're talking about IT and cybersecurity, and even in that narrower, it's still gigantic, but even in the risk management context that relates to cybersecurity, tremendous expertise is required. Hopefully, you have the benefit of a well-resourced IT team with depth of expertise. But as you can see from some of even those simple examples that we drew out, the range of knowledge required in an IT context to do great risk management is is pretty broad. And so investing in having that all on your team may or may not be viable or possible, but it's important acknowledgement to have and something to be mindful of. And that, in fact, to the second bullet here, that where you place your attention first should be informed, in fact, by expertise. That's key. You can leverage your experts to help with that prioritization and assessment phase, really. That's a fundamental lever to take advantage of. And that it requires expertise at that mitigation stage is sort of a default. And in fact, that's where most of us, I think, our attention immediately goes is, well, I need like an IT team to do patch management and software vulnerability management. But there are other aspects of risk management that relate to things like business process, right? How are your financial transactions managed? Where might a social engineering attack find its way in and intercept a financial transaction? That's a component of expertise that also plays into this.
Yeah, great point. So this is sort of coming up to our last point on the challenges side, is that it can be time consuming.
For decision makers is perhaps the most important to understand because it will inform the level of investment one makes in risk management, in order to shrink the time and the resources and energy it requires to do it well. But it is fundamentally important to understand that because this is a complex process, it is shaped by the nature of your IT environment. It will take time. The second point is really key there, that new threats pop up daily. I mean, even more frequently than that, frankly. But that dynamism in the cybersecurity environment, in the domain, frankly, impacts all of our IT teams. Even the simple effort of tracking the day's media articles on, what security research has been published that day, what 0 days or perhaps not even 0 days are making the news. Most IT teams simply don't have the time to do such a thing. But that is a really important and useful tool if you've got a partner or a vendor, whoever else that might supply you with such insight. Really, really important, but it does take time. And the evolving threat landscape is it's important to understand that not only, like we said, this is a set of technical challenges, but that there are user challenges in this context as well, and that those require significant time and energy, not just necessarily the time and energy of your IT team, but if you're investing in user awareness training, to try and give I'll pick a precise example, your accounting team, some insight into how to detect and watch out for social engineering attacks. That's their time spent on it as well. All of these things are investments of time. So it's just an important thing to be mindful of. And that there's a recurring or continuous, depending on how you will want to look at it, investment. This is not a one-time thing either. This relates to the relationship between monitoring and identification, and that really, ideally, if you can think about this as a cycle, I think that provides the most stability and investment in risk management. It's not one time. That's really, really important. Which speaks to the final bullet about the need to continuously monitor for threats and respond to them. Of course, this is a dynamic environment. Our IT environments are dynamic. Even if it's as simple as having personnel change. Different people will use their devices differently and have different approaches to whatever it might be, their browsing habits and those sorts of things. And so our IT teams must be ready to adjust continuously. And so, of course, all of this relates to the cost and time.
Yeah. So we walked through some of the challenges, and certainly don't want anyone leaving here thinking like, oh my goodness, well, you told me a bunch of things I should be that I should be doing, and they told me it was real hard. So how the heck can I stay on top of this, right? So we'll talk a little bit through the how-tos or how-tos, depending on how you want to read that, of things that you can be doing in order to sort of overcome those challenges. And some of that is relying on, as you say, that finding the right expertise, finding the right solutions and tools that are working for you in order to overcome those challenges. So if you can kind of walk us through some of those areas to kind of help them help our viewers and our listeners on that journey.
Mm. Yeah, so the first point, I guess, so maybe even before this full visibility point, really understanding risk management as part of, complexity management and as a part of normal IT management. That's kind of like the key and most important takeaway. That lends itself well to great future decision making in this context. But in practical terms, full visibility, understanding your IT environment, both in the context of hardware devices, but also cloud services, and those users. This is an important and incredible value add for your IT teams. If you can give them an aperture, a window into the environment that they can leverage for risk management, it is a huge, huge, huge leg up. There are lots of different, as we all know, lots of different tools, techniques, vendors, and services in this context. But if you think about it through the lens, sorry for the play on words, of a window in to your IT environment, providing visibility, an aperture, this is a great foundational starting point.
Full visibility, and then what?
So when we say automate prioritization, this is about the time management, the resource management associated with risk management as well, right? So ideally, the tools and the processes that you are applying early on are informing some degree of automated prioritization. In our own context, we do this with our reporting, threading in prioritization that it is based on risk measurement and related metrics. And there are many, many tools and frameworks for this. CVE scoring, like I said before, is a great and easy example of it. But there are lots. Creating or borrowing, from others, a roadmap for managing risk is a great and useful tool for decision makers in your organization as well. And ideally, that will have, if it's not there right out of the gates, some plan for contributing to the automation of risk prioritization as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this earlier on, right? That sometimes that prioritization can be the toughest part, but you can make it manageable. Because I think if it's up to all of us to decide, look at a giant list of things and decide what needs to be done first, that's when it can feel overwhelming, right? So leaning on something that can really help out and automating it and making it easy for you, so you're just kind of ticking through the highest, the most critical ones. I think that sort of gives you the feeling of control again, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, sort of related to the automating prioritization is finding and leaning on some of the expert. You talked a lot about expertise throughout this conversation for sure.
Yeah, I think this is where what one ought to be looking for is a range of expertise that relates closely to your context, your organization, and your IT context. Like we'd mentioned before, both as it relates to prioritization, but determining what remediation you should do, in what order, and in fact how to do it is not within everybody's reach necessarily. Depending on the size and nature of your organization and all of those kinds of things. Which is why it's really important to find someone who can do this for you or contribute to you doing it for yourself in a way that makes good sense for you. We say things here like a jargon-free, step-by-step sort of instruction. This is all really, really important. What we're talking about, like we said already, is complex, and anything that you can do to simplify it or insist on simplification is really, really important. And the last bullet on this slide, that great risk management and cybersecurity fundamentally are not just about finding the problems, that really it is about having a view of all of your the domain with which or upon which you're responsible for, and the tools, the levers, however you want to look at it, to protect those remediation pieces. If you can do that proactively, you're obviously way better off.
Yeah. And I do like that point on the jargon free, as you say, because it's all well and good to have something in place and to have, experts helping you out. But if they're just talking at you and your experts speak, you might not even know the right questions to ask, right? So it's sort of a
Yes.
translation into a language that makes sense and that you can execute on.
Yes, absolutely. And we've seen every IT team is different and every organization is different. Many organizations have no IT team, and they rely on one or two people to do most of the IT management.
Yeah.
And, for them, they might not know what RDP is necessarily. And so it's very, very important that all of the simplicity that can be brought to bear is in the context of expert remediation.
This is sort of stepping a little bit, but what are some of those things that you can be doing to actually go out and be hunting for those threats too, right? It's sort of a more active approach to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, so depending on the nature of your organization and your teams, you may have the opportunity for very proactive threat hunting or vulnerability discovery, depending on, how you want to look at it. Or you might, sort of outsource that to a security service provider. But really, what we're talking about here is maintaining sort of a live view, at least periodically, into your environment. Sort of peeking around corners is a simple metaphor that wouldn't normally be peeked around necessarily, or looking at new data sets that might not necessarily get looked at. All of these sorts of things. There's a barrage of different workflows and techniques that apply to threat hunting. But really, what we're trying to instill here is the notion that there's um, there's good value to be drawn out of maintaining a live or frequent view of the changes in your environment and where threats or vulnerabilities might have peaked in. And that requires a slightly different approach, different tools and techniques than what might be a standard approach to monitoring in that identify all the way through to monitoring sense.
Yeah, you talked earlier about sort of new threats popping up daily, and it's that extra step of like, okay, now is a threat. Now let's go see where we're finding it, and that's so the whole thing is a life cycle, right? Of how one of these things sort of feeds in into the other, and it's looking at the same old threats, new and emerging threats, like really across the board. So we have one more slide on the sort of the things that we can be doing before we wrap it up here. So walk us through the ultimate, well, I guess it's really the second last, because there's a conclusion slide, but the prevention and protection side, which is really sort of at the heart of your DNA, I know.
Yeah, I guess so. Let me really at its heart, when we say prevent and protect, what we're saying is risk management fundamentally. The importance of having visibility into your environment, like we said, really can't be overstated. And choosing a security solution that gives you that level of insight is, I think, probably the most important first step for most organizations these days. It's all fed by understanding your IT environment and the needs of your organization, and feeding that into that identify process all the way through to monitoring. Choosing a vendor, a solution, or implementing one on your own. There's a whole bunch of different sort of decision-making trees that you might apply to such a thing. But really, I think understanding whether the level of insight into your environment that you need is going to be provided is step one. And ensuring that the communication of that makes sense to you is step two. So that jargon-free piece, simplicity, all of that is really, really important. Like Libby said, if you can't operationalize or take action on the risk information that you're being provided, it's not really worth anything to you. So you need to make sure that it relates to your context and that it's delivered to you in a fashion that you and your team can actually operationalize. So if you do not have an IT team, it must be simple, it must be highly tactical and easy for someone to flip into an action. If you do have an IT team, it can take a slightly different shape. And in fact, you might be able to leverage your IT team in a very different way because of that. So anyway, all of that to say that at this stage, the prevention and protection, it kind of speaks for itself under the context of risk management, and that choosing a solution is about understanding your organization, your organizational context, and the work that you're going to do as a result of the insight given to you.
Yeah. I always liken that complexity side, that like there is no way that cybersecurity and risk and cyber risk management isn't complex. It just is. It shouldn't, however, be complex for the person who's trying to run their business or is trying to support their business, right? Like it's the complexity is there. It's just where in that supply chain does that complexity get managed? And it shouldn't be, as you say, at the person who is just trying to keep up with the business and trying to make sure that they're protected, right? So it's sort of that supply chain management of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the timeline of the attack, and as we say at the bottom bullet here, early rapid detection is critically important. But like the point of risk management, obviously, is to get out ahead of that as much as you can, reduce that threat surface or attack surface, reduce the likelihood of an event occurring even by accident, as we said, and ultimately giving your teams the benefit of enjoying all of that prevention.
So that is the sort of the summary of, or sorry, that is those are the points that we had here. Did you want to just take a minute here to wrap us up, Earl?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess the first bullet that we have here about a fixation on detection and response, really, I think that's what I would say most importantly for people to take away, in addition to our four components. Risk management is about more than just detection and response. That really there is not only a proactive, investment in prevention and all of those sorts of things, but that there are many dimensions to it that relate not just to your technology, but to your business processes as well, your people, their understanding of risk and cyber risk. Social engineering is the example that always pops to my mind as the most common sort of extension of technical risk into the human domain, that I don't want to say gets ignored in the context of risk management, but certainly is a second-class citizen to detection and response. So anyway, I would encourage everybody to think about risk a bit more broadly, still under the umbrella of cybersecurity, but it's not just about technical risk necessarily. In the second bullet here, we all know this, and we've seen the stories. An attack can unfold very, very quickly, whether it's a business email compromise, ransomware that permeates a complex network. It happens quickly, unfortunately, and as we all know, the implications, the impacts of it are significant. And in the final bullet, to Libby's point earlier about an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure, that is really the bottom line. The key thing for me there as an IT practitioner myself is that it's also about giving your teams a level of tooling, comfort, and stress reduction, frankly, by investing in this early on. I think that that's really, really important. As somebody who works squarely in the space of cybersecurity, but with IT teams are doing cybersecurity, and it is a difficult, stressful endeavor. And we wrap it up in terms like risk management. So any investment that decision makers make in that space will reduce stress on teams. That's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I started taking away is like, what are all the things that we can do to make a cyber attacker's job as hard as possible, right? Like, let's really make let's really make it hard for them. Thank you so much, Earl, for walking us through that. That was super interesting. Every time we chat, I learn something new, and I always get a new Earlism to add to my list. So thank you very much for walking us through. Thanks everyone for attending today, for listening in. Hope to see you soon.